Well, today's devotional is actually for Sunday, November the 6th. My joy to be able to come to you today with the title of this devotional from Sunday, The Tyranny of the Majority, and then a quote that you're hearing often, democracy is on the ballot. Now, our scripture reading, Romans chapter 13, Romans chapter 14. What an appropriate devotional this is, because tomorrow, if you are a citizen of the United States, you have an opportunity to get out the vote. Well, let's look at Romans chapter 13 and find here a continuing study of the doctrines and yet the practicality of those doctrines. Now, for instance, Romans 13 introduced the question of the believer and his relationship with civil government and human authority. You find that in the first 7 verses. Then, going on to verse 8, Paul then addressed something that's very practical, and that is, owe no man anything. In other words, don't be in debt. And then finally, verses 8 through 10, Paul emphasized the overriding command to love one another, the sum of the commandments. Well, Romans chapter 14 continued the practical application of the scriptures to one's daily life and walk, and focused on the believer's liberty, deportment, and influence on other believers. Now, in the matter of a critical judgmental spirit, you find that in Romans 14, verses 3 and 4, and verses 10 through 15, Paul warned, so then every one of us shall give an account of himself to God in verse 12. Well, I want to spend the balance of today's devotional that on something that might seem political, but really it isn't. It's very practical from a spiritual standpoint. And it is taken from Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, and it addresses the believer's citizenship and relationship with civil authority. Now, here's a question for you, especially if you are a citizen of the United States. Whether it's, the question would be this: democracy or republic? Is there a difference? Now, if you live in the United States, you're aware we have an opportunity to exercise our civic duty tomorrow and vote for those who represent us in government. And we're hearing this quote, a relentless theme of the Democratic Party that says, quote, democracy is on the ballot. Well, the implication, of course, is that the candidates of the other party, Republicans, are a threat to democracy. Well, the government of these United States is that of a republic, not a democracy. Now, a republic is a form of government that represents we the people. The elected leaders rule by consent of the people and function as representatives of the people for the common good. Now, in a republic, you see, there is no hierarchy or upper tier of leadership. The power of government rests not with the presidency or with the Senate or with the House of Representatives. The power of authority of government rests with we the people, individual citizens who have delegated to our leaders their authority. Now, the statement, democracy is on the ballot, should be a grave concern to every American. Though the nature of a democracy is dependent upon the will of the people, it poses a frightening danger I will describe as the tyranny of the majority. An individual citizen, you see, has protected rights and a voice in a republican form of government. A democracy, on the other hand, has a tendency to evolve into a rule of the majority at the oppression and sacrifice of the individual. Well, when the virtuous character of a society deteriorates, so does its tolerance for the individual and individual rights. For instance, Adolf Hitler rose to power in the German Republic. But in a void of leadership, Hitler and the Nazi Party, representing democratic socialist policies, slowly gained a following of the majority of the German people. With the majority in power, A campaign of intimidation began to attack and silence political opponents. Concentration camps were opened. Political opponents were arrested. Finally, when all oppositional political parties were outlawed, a campaign to exterminate the Jewish people began, and the freedom of the press and speech were revoked. Well, as a Bible believer, whether you identify as a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, there is one thing that cannot be on the ballot, and that is our submission to King Jesus. Paul's letter to believers in Rome was addressed to citizens of that empire who knew all too well the tyranny of a dictator. No doubt the apostle, who was himself a Roman citizen, had been questioned concerning the relationship and obligation of believers to those in authority. Well, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 6, addressed in very specific terms the moral obligation believers have to all human authority. You see, in his first letter to the early church, Peter would command believers in 1 Peter 2, verse 17, honor the king. Well, while there was much about a king's character that was not honorable, there was nevertheless a responsibility for believers to treat the ruler with dignity regarding his office and authority. Yet, believers are not only to honor those in authority, but we're also to recognize that human authority is delegated by God. Now, while the governed are to submit to authority, government has a responsibility to protect and ensure the safety and security of the citizens. Romans 13, verses 2 through 4. And so let me give you some closing thoughts as we want to get out the vote. Whether a republic, democracy, or monarchy. Leaders are accountable to God. Sorry about that little word slip. And are to rule, understanding their role is that of a minister or servant to God, of God. Now, believers are to revere leaders as the servants of God for good. Romans 13 and verse 4. And the wicked shall fear the judgment of the same. Now, the inherent sinfulness of man, Romans 13 verse 10, 12, and 23, requires a government that is ready to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil, Romans 13 and verse 4. Well, believers have a moral obligation then to be subject to the laws of man, with one exception. When the laws of the land violate God's law, when the apostles faced authorities who forbade them to preach the gospel, they answered, we ought to obey God rather than men. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were commanded by Nebuchadnezzar to worship his idol or die, they respectfully answered, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden idol which thou hast set up. When King Darius commanded that no man was to pray to his God for 30 days, the godly prophet Daniel went home, and we read in Daniel 6, verses 9 through 10, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. What is the principle? God, not government, is the believer's highest authority. Now listen, when you cast your vote this Tuesday, consider this question. Which candidate aspires to be the minister, that is the servant of God for good? That is the candidate you should vote for. Republican, Democrat, Independent, that's not the issue. The issue is that we cast our vote for those who are carrying out God's sovereign plan for human government, and that is to execute wrath and judgment against the evil and to make sure that those who are good live in peace. May you and I seek God's favor in the stewardship of our vote. Thank you for joining me for Heart of a Shepherd.